November 1994, Tacoma, Washington. A young woman would go to the local mall to start her Christmas shopping. She would spend a few hours in the complex, browsing various deals, hoping to finish all of her holiday purchases in one evening. By nightfall, she would finish up and make her way through the cold air and dark parking lot, where she would finally reach her car. She would then load up the trunk, quickly cross the parking lot to return the cart, and make her way back. When she got back to the car door, she began digging around in her purse for the key, trying to hurry and get out of the freezing temperature, when all of a sudden, she felt a painful stinging sensation near her ankle. It hurt so much, she dropped her purse and fell to the ground, clutching her foot. She seen blood pouring out onto the pavement as she began to scream in agony. She soon realized her Achilles tendon had been slashed, but it only got worse because as she lay there trying to figure out what had happened, a man suddenly rode out from underneath her car holding a bloody razor blade, no doubt what he had used to slice her. He quickly turned over her purse, and while the woman was screaming for help, the bag emptied her keys onto the ground. He snatched them up, jumped up, unlocked the car, got in, and peeled out, stealing the woman's car along with all the Christmas gifts. Luckily, the woman would be found and authorities were called, and after medical attention, her ankle fully recovered. However, when her car was eventually found, all of the gifts were gone, leaving the anonymous woman broke with no more money for gifts. This story was soon picked up and began making circles on the internet, which was still pretty young back in 1994. Soon, other stories popped up that seemed to confirm this woman's account, as other women were being robbed too, and in some instances, they were even being done worse, like some were being cut down at the ankle and, not being able to escape, were assaulted. Reports poured into the police, who were powerless to help. This was before the days where security cameras were everywhere, and DNA was still in its infancy, and the perps were picking dark, empty parking lots. It was just really difficult to stop, although some speculated that the police were intentionally looking the other way. But why? Because allegedly, they were trying to protect businesses at the mall, and they wanted to keep panic from spreading, and for some reason, the newspapers even refused to report on it. Or maybe it's because they were told not to by the local authorities. It was like these attackers were ghosts, or that they didn't exist, and that's because they didn't, at least according to the ankle slicer urban legend. This story has taken on many variations over the years, with the one from Tacoma in 1994 just as an example. Others, as mentioned previously, stated that after the ankle slicing, the suspect would abduct the woman and then take her somewhere else hidden where he could then assault her, while the story got even darker in more tellings when the ankle slicing attacks became part of a gang initiation. According to the story, once the victim, usually a woman, was down on the ground clutching her ankle, the suspect would reach down and cut her finger off before fleeing, which he could then use as proof to get into a gang. This version would begin making its way around the internet in 1999, where it was emphasized that it was not a hoax and to please pass it on to other people. But Tacoma wasn't the only story to play home to this legend. Fargo, Birmingham, Alabama, Columbus, LA, Pittsburgh, and maybe the most famous, Chicago. Because in 1991, the rumors got so bad in Chicago that ankle slicers were hiding under cars that the city almost went into a panic. The police would end up establishing a hotline for people to call in for information, where the authorities would then calmly explain to them that this was just an urban legend that had been going on for decades and that there was no real ankle slicer threat. Within the first 4 days of the hotline being set up, they received over 400 phone calls. But just when did all this actually start, and why? One folklorist, Jan Brumvard, set out to find those answers, and she surprisingly discovered that the first reporting of the ankle slicer goes back to the 1950s at the Northland Shopping Mall in Detroit, Michigan. But the first time that it actually caused a city-wide scare was in Fargo, North Dakota in 1978, and basically, it has popped up in different cities all over the country for decades, with usually slightly different details. Even in 2021, rumors would pop up in Joliet and Aurora, Illinois. The young men undergoing gang initiations were hiding under the cars at the mall and slashing ankles of women and then assaulting them. Even after being told by authorities that it was nothing more than an urban legend, Many refuse to believe it, with some churches warning their congregation and store managers discussing it with their employees. As far as the why, that is pretty easy to explain. A lot of it has to do with leaving the mall, which, back then, was really busy, and well lit and warm, and exiting that and walking into the parking lot, where it could be cold and dark. Well, it's like a 180-degree turn in the environment, which raises our anxiety, and on a more primal level, it may play on fears that we had as a child, like the boogeyman hiding under your bed, getting ready to grab your ankles. Vampires are mythical beings that probably don't need much explanation. As you all know, the undead vampire lives only by the consumption of blood of the living, which of course causes problems for his would-be victims, but I probably don't need to go too deep into that because everyone knows the general vampire lore, and I probably don't need to give a deep history on where it came from, because the vampire myth has been around forever, right? Well, sorta. Vampires as we know them are actually a modern invention, with the word itself becoming popular around the 18th century in Western Europe after hearing about a mass hysteria taking place in Eastern Europe. According to those stories, in 1656, a panic broke out in a small village in Croatia after a man named Yuri Grando had allegedly become a vampire after he died, and he began drinking blood from his victims, and he also sexually harassed his widow. The village leader ordered that he be dug up and have a stake driven through his heart. The corpse was also beheaded, which would lead to the very first description of a vampire. But it was also a much different vampire than we know now. Instead of the pale, hungry-looking, sometimes handsome vampires of today's movies and TV shows, these vampires were said to be bloated and dark, or sometimes purple in color, and they often wore shrouds, and you could sometimes see blood seeping from their mouth and nose once they were put into the coffin, or maybe even with its left eye open. Sometimes even chewing sounds were said to have been heard coming from their graves. But our modern vampire is shaped by the extremely popular and successful Dracula by Bram Stoker in 1897, which was said to be based on real-life Romanian ruler Vlad the Impaler. However, that's heavily disputed. What's not is this the most influential vampire work ever, and it's went on to define the genre. But contrary to misconception, it was not the first vampire story that actually belonged to writer John Polidori, who published The Vampire almost 80 years earlier in 1819. But to circle back to the original question, if the modern vampire goes back to the 18th century, then why does it seem like its history goes further back? Crazily enough, basically every culture in the world, past and present, had some kind of vampire-like myth. Even going back to the Romans, there were tales of spirits and demons that were basically vampires in all sense of the word. It's these tales that would eventually lead to the term we know today. But what caused these demons or spirits? That too varied by culture. In Slavic and Chinese cultures, they believed any corpse that had been jumped over by an animal, especially a dog or cat, could possibly become undead. Likewise, if someone died with a wound that had not been treated with boiling water, well, it's just possible they could also become part of the undead. While Russian folklore, on the other hand, believed anyone who had been witches or opposed the Russian church would become a vampire after death. The blood-drinking taboo itself goes back to man's early days and, as mentioned, was attributed to demons, or often the devil, who was said to also eat the flesh of humans when the possibility arose. The Persians were one of the first civilizations to record tales of the so-called blood-drinking demons, as creatures attempting to drink blood from men has been found on pottery. Ironically enough, the Age of Enlightenment, a period of the 17th and 18th centuries, which saw the decline of ghosts and other silly superstitions, actually saw an uptick in vampire panics, with numerous alleged attacks taking place all across Europe, which led to numerous scholars and theologians releasing several works to debunk the claims, and eventually outlawed digging up graves. But of course, with so many possibilities to see a loved one turn to the undead, people began coming up with ways to stop it, like burying someone upside down, which became a fairly common practice, because for some reason, it allegedly stopped vampires completely. It also became fairly common to put scythes next to graves to satisfy demons or appease the dead to keep them from rising, while more dire prevention methods were used elsewhere in Europe, like severing the tendons at the knees to keep them from getting to their feet in case they did attempt to rise from the grave. Strangely, according to legends from China, India, and Europe, vampires were very OCD in the sense that any time they came across tiny objects, they had to stop and count all of them. So in Europe, this led to people burying their loved ones with poppy seeds, because they figured if the undead awoke, they would be too preoccupied counting them. Likewise, the Chinese believed vampires would stop if they came across a bag of rice, because they just had to stop and count every grain. The myth, as mentioned, was also believed in India, and weirdly, South American cultures had a similar tale when it came to witches and other evil spirits. However, if these precautions didn't stop the vampire from raising from the dead, and he started terrorizing the village, you would get a few signs. Evidence of vampires in your town or village was said to emerge when freshly dug graves were found to have holes in them. Likewise, anytime cattle or sheep were found killed with no explanation as to how was also a sign of vampires. But it also applied to unexplained deaths of neighbors or other people living in the village. And if you heard the sounds of something hitting your roof, then it very well could be a vampire throwing stones at it. But you were not protected when you slept either, because vampires could allegedly press on your chest while you were sleeping and you could not get away, which we know today as sleep paralysis. So now a vampire is terrorizing your town. What can you do? Of course, the most famous defense ever is garlic, which, for whatever reason, keeps vampires at bay. But less famous is that of wild rose or hawthorn, which can cause the vampire harm. Other things like crucifixes and holy water would also harm them, while many other stories claimed they could not enter a church or temple. Alright, so now you staved off the undead and went Van Helsing all over the vampire, so it's over, right? Not hardly, because according to the legends, vampires can only truly be killed if a stake is driven through their heart. Although, in some cultures, you could also do it by driving it through their mouth or stomach. And it wasn't because of some symbolic driving through the heart that kills it. It was more of a way to deflate the body, because the undead would often bloat. And depending on which culture, the stake had to be a particular piece of wood, often aspen, because it's believed to be what the cross that Jesus died on was made of. Sometimes you didn't need to go the extra mile and drive a stake through. Some cultures believed you could just decapitate the undead and then bury their head between their feet or move it away from their body. This was said to hasten up the departure of their soul and keep their spirit from hanging around. And I have to point out here, these parts are not folklore. Archaeologists have found several graves like this, as well as finding skeletons with iron rods driven through their chest, and evidence of steel being placed into the mouths of skeletons. Or one grave was even found with a female who had a brick forced into the mouth. That is all fine and well, but it still doesn't answer the main question. Where does the belief come from? I mean, with it popping up in nearly every culture in mankind, it has to have a common cause, right? Yep, and that's the scary part, because one major theory when it comes to the origin of vampire beliefs is premature burial. One of the scariest things to think about, being buried alive. But because medical knowledge was not very advanced, sometimes it did happen. This led to people walking by graves and hearing sounds coming from the ground and coughing. But by the time they were dug up, they would only find fingernail marks from where the unlucky victim had tried to escape. Sometimes they would even hit their heads, faces, and noses trying to get out. And when someone opened their coffin and seen their busted up faces and blood, they believed they had been feeding. Of course, with that theory, it doesn't explain how some of these people stayed alive for so long without food, water, or air. Others suggest the noises from the graves were just the bubbling of escaping gases from natural decomposition. Sticking with that line of thinking, it was also just their crude understanding of the death process and decomposition. If a corpse didn't look like one thought it should, it could sometimes lead to the theory that it was a vampire, when in reality, decomposition happens at different speeds depending on varying circumstances. Likewise, disease could also leave a corpse looking like a typical vampire. Of course, that is all the old days and doesn't happen now, right? Scarily enough, in 2002 and 2003, allegations of vampire attacks swept through Malawi, which led to mobs stoning at least one person to death and attacking 4 others, including the governor, because it was said that the government was working with these vampires, while in 2017, another 6 people were killed that were alleged to be vampires. Ring around the Rosie, a pocket full of posies. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. That is something you have no doubt heard in your childhood days, and is known in America as the Ring Around the Rosie, while in England it's known as Ring-a-Ring-a Roses. Regardless, we all know it's a nursery rhyme and playground singing game. There's many versions of the game, which usually sees the children form a ring, dance in a circle around a person, and on the final line, everyone tries to sit down. The slowest child then becomes the Rosie by sitting in the middle of the ring. The song dates back to at least the 1840s, but do you know where that song actually comes from? Could it be a very dark set of circumstances that led to the lyrics? I bet many of you upon hearing this already have heard this theory before, that the children's song is based upon a nightmare scenario, that of the Great Plague of London in 1665, or sometimes the Black Death of the 14th century. But did you know that's actually an urban legend? Yep, that's right. So many people had come to believe this, but there's actually no proof for it. And it probably started due to the fact that we have no idea what the song is about. It's been left up to speculation for a long time. In fact, although the song has been around since the mid-19th century, the theory that it was a metaphor for the Great Plague of London didn't even come about until a full century later. Before the Second World War, there is zero mention that the nursery rhyme is connected with any plague whatsoever, but by 1951, it somehow became the generally understood explanation, and nobody actually knows why. It seems like people just started connecting the Rosie to a rosy rash which developed with the disease, and the posies, which were small bouquets of herbs that were carried as protection to ward off the smell of the disease. And then, of course, falling down was the last thing that happened to you once you died from it. The ashes ashes part was said to refer to the cremation of the bodies, as well as some variations of the song mention sneezing. But absolutely none of this was true. First of all, how come the song had been around a full century before anyone made the link to the plague? Secondly, the symptoms don't really fit that well with the plague, and if it is referencing the Black Death from the 14th century, well, they weren't even allowed to burn the bodies of the dead in England then. And in some versions of the song, ashes actually do not even appear, and a different word is used. So what does it mean exactly? By the late 19th century, a book called A Dictionary of British Folklore believed the game to be of pagan origin, stating it was related to some pagan myths, specifically citing a passage from another book called Deutsche Mythology, which reads, "Gifted children of fortune have the power to laugh roses." Others suggest that it's nothing more than what it literally says, making a ring around roses and then bowing with the all fall down in the bending of the knee gesture seen in some traditional greetings. While the book Games and Songs of American Children, published in 1883, stated the Rosie was simply the French word for a rose tree. In fact, there's some versions of this song in other languages that translates to rose bush, meaning basically the song was nothing more than a child's game. Some folklorists have even speculated that it may have came from the Protestants banning dancing in the 19th century, which led to play parties and ring-type games. But for some bizarre reason, a century after the song came out, it got twisted into this dark urban legend, and nobody knows why. One late night in spring 1992, a woman named Sarah would leave work after a very long shift. She was exhausted and was beginning to feel sleepy. The road was pretty desolate at this late night hour, as she passed only an occasional truck, and just as she thought the biggest danger would be falling asleep at the wheel, other dangers would soon arise, because a SUV suddenly got behind her and began flashing its lights intermittently. Sarah, of course, was not going to fall for any dangerous ploy to pull to the side of the highway for this strange individual behind her. Plenty of terrible stories start that way, but the driver was persistent, and he began to honk the horn at her and began swerving aggressively as if he was trying to warn her. She became more frightened though and sped up, Trying to put as much distance as she could between her and the driver, the SUV continued to tail her closely though, so she began to think quickly and pulled off the highway and found a gas station. As she pulled in and parked, the SUV quickly pulled in beside her. Sarah would jump out, no longer sleepy, and began rushing inside to the gas station with cell phone in hand. The man driving the SUV, though, would jump out and yell, "Wait, miss, the reason I was following you was to tell you a man is hiding in your back seat." Sarah then peeked back and seen the dark outline of a man hiding behind the seats, and looking closer, she seen the faint reflection of a pair of eyes. Sarah then called the police, and the man opened the back door and took off running. This is just one variation of the killer in the back seat urban legend, and there are just so many variations of this story that have been told over the years. Sometimes the woman is drawn in by a gas station attendant while she is filling up, under the guise that her card was declined or something. The woman, not trusting him because he is burly and unkempt, makes the woman hesitant to go in, and when she does, he then warns her of the killer in the back seat. Sometimes the perp is carrying a knife, hatchet, or meat cleaver. Other times, he is carrying nothing. In some tellings, the car behind the woman was flashing the headlights every time he seen the man in the back seat pop up to kill her. Other times, the female driver escapes what she thinks is a crazed motorist, flashing his headlights behind her, and then makes it home, only for the crazed killer to rise up out of the back seat and descend upon her. And of course, in every story, it's always a female victim, calling out to the classic cliche of damsel in distress. But where does this come from, and how long has it been around? Crazily enough, this has been a thing since the 60s. It's like a very old form of creepypasta. It serves as a cautionary tale for us to be vigilant of our surroundings, even in places like our own car. It teaches a moral lesson, like not judging a book by its cover, the burly-looking gas station attendant was actually the hero, etc. But is it based on a real event? Well, there have been assaults where the attacker hid in the back seat, but as far as a murder goes, there's no accounts of that. Although there have been some close calls. In Indiana in 1990, a man hiding in a woman's van was spotted as she went through the drive-thru, causing him to jump out and flee. Another time, a criminal hid inside the car of a man that he had no idea was a police detective, and when he tried to attack him, the detective shot and killed him. This took place in New York in 1964, and it's this one that might actually be the early inspiration for the urban legend. Strangely, you can still see warnings online about the backseat killer even today. Many times, it's on social media where it takes on new variations. When it comes to American heroes, there are many to choose from, especially during the early period of the country. But when it comes to Tennessee heroes, well, no other is bigger than Davy Crockett. The soldier/politician, and of course, frontiersman, was born in 1786 in what was then North Carolina, because Tennessee was still technically 10 years away from becoming a state. But he did grow up in what we now know as East Tennessee, and his family did have financial struggles. So much so that Davy's father indentured him to a man named Jacob Seiler to help tend to cattle in exchange to pay off debts. The next year, he tried to enroll Davy at school, but he began playing hooky after he got into trouble with another kid, which led to Davy's father attempting to whip him. And I'm guessing at this point, Davy had enough. Maybe it's because his own father essentially sold him as a slave for a while, or maybe he was just abusive. But Davy ran away and joined a cattle drive. He did return to his dad's tavern just 4 years later though, at the age of 16, where his father once again loaned him out to do manual labor to pay off debts. After the debts were paid, Davy was given permission to leave, and he would actually go back and work for one of the men that he had been indentured to, except this time, he worked for himself. But it was the changes that would come over the next few years that would make Davy a folk hero. As wars with Native Americans were heating up, particularly the Creek War, Davy would join the military. And although he did take an active part in some of the fighting, he became more well known for his scouting abilities and mostly his hunting, as he would often bring back wild game for the soldiers to feast on. By 1815, he would leave the military, and just 2 years later, he began seeking public office, first as a county commissioner, and within a few years, he had been given many public responsibilities, such as Justice of the Peace and Lieutenant Colonel of the 57th Regiment of Tennessee, in addition to running multiple businesses. Because of this, he had hardly any time, so he resigned from his post and ran for a bigger office like the Tennessee General Assembly. But he was still destined for bigger things, and he would launch his campaign to be elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and he lost. But he was convinced by others to try again 2 years later, and this time he won, and he would be re-elected for a second term. He would largely focus his legislative efforts on helping settlers get better deals for their land titles, but his political career would take a hit at this time because a senator from Tennessee and future president, Andrew Jackson, just did not get along with Davy at all. The two had a bitter political rivalry stemming back over a decade, and both men always supported whatever candidate the other was running against. But in 1830, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which forcefully moved more than 60,000 Native Americans to west of the Mississippi in the Indian Territory, which ultimately led to the Trail of Tears. Now Davy was 100% against this. Not only did it do the Native Americans wrong, but it basically broke every treaty the United States had signed with them. But unfortunately for Davy, he was the only member of the Tennessee delegation to vote against it, and he lost a lot of support in his own district and was defeated in the next election. He would run and win again in 1833, but essentially didn't get anything done, since nobody really wanted to work with him because of his rivalry with Andrew Jackson and his opposition to the Indian Act. And he ran again and lost in 1835, and that's where he would tell the papers, "I told the people of my district that I would serve them faithfully, as I had done before, but if they did not re-elect me, then they could go to hell and I would go to Texas." And Texas is where he would go to join the revolution that was about to happen soon. As he left Tennessee, he drew a crowd, as he had become quite the celebrity. He would stop and give a speech on Texas independence, and finally left. Now from here, I'll skip to the biggest part of this story, and why he is known as a folk hero to this day. He would arrive at the Alamo on February 8th to help Texas secede from Mexico. And just 15 days later, they were surprised by the Mexican army and a siege began. The men were now stuck with little ammo and no reinforcements. Several messengers had already been dispatched to a James Fannin, who commanded a group of Texas soldiers in Goliad, but Fannin thought it was too risky to send soldiers, although Davy, along with 2 others, would eventually go to Fannin and bring back reinforcements. But it did little to change the outcome, and by March 6th, the Mexican army began attacking right before dawn while the defenders were asleep. They awoke and began to fight, while the non-combatants went to hide in a church. Davy would even go to the chapel and pray before he returned to his post. As the Mexican soldiers began scaling the wall, the Texians fell back to their barracks and chapel as planned, but Davy and his men were too far away and got left out in the open. They defended the low wall in front of the church, even using their rifles as clubs and using their knives because the combat was too fast to reload. But the Mexican soldiers pushed the remaining defenders back to the church, and after an hour and a half, it was done. They were defeated. The bodies were taken nearby and stacked together and burned. But that's where our mystery gets started, and Davy's legend takes hold, because no one actually knows how Davy died. The legend states that he made a heroic last stand, and that image is so burned into our minds that his name in America is pretty much immediately connected with that. But there are accounts that he simply surrendered with other men and was promptly executed. But the craziest part is, there's tons of records that support both accounts. As far as the heroic last stand goes, it got started by a former slave named Ben, who was one of the cooks for the Mexican army, and he stated when they found Davy's body, he was surrounded by no less than 16 Mexican corpses, with one of them having Davy's knife buried inside. However, a Mexican officer at the battle, a Jose Enrique de la Pena, would have his memoirs discovered over a century later, where he noted that Davy simply gave up with some other soldiers and was executed not long after. This actually caused quite a controversy, and people dismissed it as fraudulent. But by 2001, testing of the manuscript revealed that it matched paper and ink used by the Mexican army at the time, and the handwriting matched other writing by De La Pena. Of course, many doubters still claimed that De La Pena would have never known who Davy Crockett was anyways. And while that may be true, once the men heard later on that Davy had died at the Alamo and how big a deal it was, he could have put two and two together and made the connection. Regardless, there are still tons of statements that back either argument, and we don't have time to cover every one of them. But to this day, no one is for sure if Davy actually made that heroic last stand that he is known for today. Winter, 1979. 27-year-old Emma from London was finally getting on the plane and heading to Mexico. She had been planning this vacation for a while, as she was completely exhausted from her job in finance, as well as the bitter cold seen in England around this time of the year. And what better way to relax than to go to Cancun? After she arrived, the first day couldn't have went any better. She enjoyed time on the beach and went shopping while also dining on the local cuisine. But on the second morning, she would awake to find a tiny red spot on her left cheek. She thought it was probably a mosquito bite and kinda blew it off, and then she put on her wide-brimmed hat and went out to explore some ancient Mayan ruins. And the bite didn't even seem like that big of a deal. In fact, it barely even itched. The following day, she would awake to see that it had become even bigger. It was now swollen and red, and she instinctively reached up to touch it, and it felt like a bruise. Suddenly, she thought this must be some kind of tropical bug that bit her, and she was now a little more worried, but not so much so that it would completely ruin the trip. Instead, her friend who had traveled with her suggested they stopped at a local market and see if there was a remedy there, and luckily enough, they found a shopkeeper who spoke English and recommended an ointment to deal with it. However, by the time the trip was over and they were on the flight home, the spot on her face had become unbearable. It was now really swollen, like a red lump. She would even feel it pulsate, and the pressure underneath her skin would not let up. She knew that after reaching the airport, she would immediately go to the doctor, and that is what she did. And after an anxious wait in the office, he finally called her back. After he began looking closer, he asked, "Have you been around spiders?" Emma thought for a second. "No, not that I know of." He then began to pick at the bump, and before she could even react, she heard a soft pop, and suddenly a stream of tiny spiders burst out from the swollen spot. Feeling the dozens of tiny legs crawling on her skin, she immediately screamed and began slapping her face. The doctor managed to wipe away the rest and calmed her down, and then cleaned the wound, explaining that a tropical spider laid its eggs under her skin during her first day in Mexico. And of course, none of this happened, but it was a very popular urban legend that emerged in England in the 1970s. The story has many variations, but follows a similar path. A woman from England, or some northern frigid location, goes on vacation in a warm southern location, and while sunbathing on the beach, she gets bitten on the cheek by a spider, whereas in our version, she doesn't even know that she was bit. And sometimes, at the end of the story, the woman is driven to insanity by the whole ordeal. Another more popular version is that of a young girl who gets bit while asleep and then tells her mother, who reassures her daughter that it will be okay. The next day it gets worse, and her mother still blows it off. But by the third day, she finally takes her to the doctor, but he wasn't in and was not expected to be back until the following day. Her mother would then draw her a hot bath, and her daughter would soak in it, and this caused the spot on her face to burst, and the spiders began crawling out. Although it did spread around England in the late 70s, it's basically a modern take on some older similar stories, like the 1843 Nathaniel Hawthorne short story called Egotism, or The Bosom Serpent, which was about a man who believed a serpent lived inside his chest. And while in that story, the serpent is seen as an allegory for the destructive nature of having an undue sense of self-importance, the term bosom serpent has become to be known as these type of stories where creatures supposedly enter the human body and live, and then sometimes reproduce, and can be removed by surgery, or they leave on their own, or just burst out from your skin. The legend, of course, spawns from man's fear of spiders. Many people hate spiders, but the ones that end up in urban legends are almost always poisonous, or hairy, or very large, or a combination of the three. And since a lot of these spiders have vanished, or are vanishing from urban environments, they have taken on a more mythical status. And it's also tied into the perception of southern locations and people, whom are unfairly viewed as being less clean. While there's also the perception that the spiders and or many other animals at these exotic locations are much more dangerous than the ones that they grew up with in England. May 6th, 1981, Brookline, Massachusetts. Citizens would be alarmed when they heard the news that the local police department had just put out an all-points bulletin, which wanted officers to look for a van containing possible child abductors. Apparently, several children had reported to adults that this van had pulled up and the occupants tried to lure them away with the promise of candy. The van was distinctive too. It was an older model with a broken headlight and no hubcaps, and it also had side ladders. But the creepiest part, the drivers were clowns, which made the whole situation that much more spooky. Shortly after the all points bulletin was put out, the van would be spotted lurking nearby the elementary school, but drove away before the police arrived. The very next day, in Boston, just 5 miles up the road, would get their own reports of a van being driven by a creepy clown. Apparently, this man had stopped at a nearby park where he was seen stalking the area. Police were dispatched and could not find him or the van, and neither could they find any witnesses who had seen either. By this time, the parents in the area got nervous, and rightfully so. It became such a stressful situation that the public school's investigative counselor issued a memo to the principals in the school's district that read, "It has been brought to the attention of the police department and the district's office that adults dressed as clowns have been bothering children to and from school. Please advise all students that they must stay away from strangers, especially those dressed as clowns." Police remained on the lookout, however, but it seems the potential child abducting clowns had left town, and the town was back at ease. However, it wasn't long until they were spotted again, but this time way over in the heartland of America, in Kansas City, Missouri. A 6th grader would tell police she saw a clown lurking around Fairfax Elementary School. She would go into great detail too, claiming the man was by a fence and he was wearing a black shirt with a devil on the front and black pants with candy canes down each side. He was apparently standing by a fence at the school, and when some of the students ran towards it, this caused the clown to run across a big yard opposite the school and towards a yellow van. This resulted in the police being dispatched, and again, when they arrived, they could find no sign of the man or van. Parents in Kansas City were now nervous as the ones in Boston, some 1,400 miles away. Could it have been the same men? Police took it seriously enough and even set up checkpoints looking for anyone dressed as a clown, as well as going on active searches looking for the van, and it didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, clowns who were trying to abduct children would be reported in over 6 major cities in the US. Many began to doubt the whole thing though. For one, not one adult had made a report. Instead, it was always young children. Even though adults may have called in the reports, it was always because the children told it to them. And every time the police were dispatched, they couldn't find anyone who had seen the clowns except the kids. This also brought up the second issue with the claims. How were these clowns so inept? I mean, thank goodness no little child was abducted, but how did these clowns get spotted multiple times within a few weeks in such a wide area, and in spite of multiple abduction attempts, failed every time? You would think after drawing the attention of law enforcement agencies across the country, you might decide to lay low for a while. And that's what makes this one creepy. None of this story was made up. The police were actually called, and children actually reported seeing them, but it just never happened. At least, not that we know of. So why did they report it? A lot of that goes back to the satanic panic that was also going on at the time, which we previously discussed on the historical series. And if you missed that, basically, it was all these false reports of abuse being perpetrated by Satanists, who were sometimes affiliated with schools and other locations, and were all later proven to be false. And children probably, hearing their parents talk about the satanic panic, either spooked themselves or just wanted to add their own stories to fit in. And clowns were a perfect fit, because so many people, especially children, fear them anyways. This one to me is so much more interesting than the 2016 clown sightings since, these clowns almost certainly didn't exist, but there's a tiny possibility that they may have, and that is pretty unsettling. Alright guys, most of these have been pretty dark, so let's end this on one that's not too somber. Paul Bunyan, a man whose stature is as large as his reputation. Bunyan was said to be a giant lumberjack whose woodcutting abilities, among other laborious tasks, were completed with his superhuman talents. He also had a pet and working animal, a giant blue ox, that he named Babe. He is exclusively an American and Canadian tale, which started in the form of an oral tradition and was passed along the earliest North American loggers, although it didn't get popular with the general public until it was written about in a promotional pamphlet about his exploits in 1916. But with all that being said, what exactly is the origin of Paul Bunyan and his famous socks? That is a mystery unto itself. What is known is that at least 30 years before the pamphlet was released detailing Bunyan, stories about him were widely circulated. They were often told at lumber camps, and contrary to the later longer published tales that came out, these stories were usually pretty short, and often were similar to even older folk tales, and even fearsome critter stories we have covered in other videos. Sometimes they were told to test out the gullibility of new recruits, or just for the fun of it. Although it wasn't until 1916 when the character first got popular, there were a few references to him in an 1893 newspaper from Gladwin County, Michigan, in which one news section read, "Paul Bunyan is gearing up to set out on his drive while the water levels are high." This is presumably an inside joke, as no one really got it, and at the time, very few in the general public would have knew the legend about Bunyan. However, the first real story came in a Duluth newspaper in 1904. Stories after this would begin to pop up, and a few would even allude to his immense stature, that of being 8 foot tall and weighing 300 pounds, as well as his great physical strength. But it was after that first advertising pamphlet that the story began to really take off, when Tales of Paul Bunyan Volume 2 started selling really well. The author took many liberties with the original stories and expanded upon the legend, like making him as tall as a giant, where he towered over the tallest trees, or that he made the 10,000 lakes of Minnesota with his footsteps along with his giant ox, or that the Grand Canyon was created from where he drug his axe behind him. Having said all that, where does this actually come from? There seems to be two opinions. First is the legend of Paul Bunyan is actually a literary invention called Folklore, and Folklore is nothing more than modern day fiction that is passed off as having been created a long time ago. That is to say, the Paul Bunyan stories that were allegedly told in the logging camp, whatever ones survived that is, were actually never told there, and instead, numerous early 20th century writers spin their own tale, hence, it was never folklore. The other line of thought is, Paul Bunyan was based on a very real man, that of a French-Canadian lumberjack named Fabien Fournier, who worked for the H.M. Loud Company in Grayling, Michigan between 1865 and 1875. He stood 6 foot tall and was a logging crew foreman. He was known for his giant hands and had a reputation for drinking and fighting. He would actually be murdered in November of 1875, allegedly by a man named Adolphus Robertson, a stonemason who struck him in the head with a mallet on a dock in Bay City, Michigan. Okay, maybe this one is not as lighthearted as I thought. Anyways, the ensuing trial of his killer brought many stories of Fournier's lumbering abilities, while others cite that Bunyan was really based on a French soldier in the Lower Canadian Rebellion in 1837 and 1838, named Paul Bunyan, and of course, Bunyan eventually evolved to Bunyan. Some even think Bunyan is a combination of both men. Interestingly, in the early 19th century, when research was being done on the origins of Paul Bunyan, many writers found old lumberjacks who claimed to have known him, or at least members of his crew. They also stated that Bunyan is buried somewhere in northern Minnesota. They would even go on to state that his gigantism was a later invention, as the earliest stories never mention it, or at best, they put him at 7 foot tall. But I ask you, do you think Paul Bunyan was based on a real person? Or do you think Paul Bunyan was a real person? Or is it folklore? Or not even that, and it was fake lore? You guys can let me know below. And that brings us to the conclusion of this video. This is a topic I've been wanting to cover for a while. You can let me know if you enjoyed it as well, and if I should do more like this in the future. For now, I say goodbye and good night.